Dr. Greg Bottaro, director of the CatholicPsych Institute, and developed an integration of mindfulness with Catholic spirituality called Catholic Mindfulness. And here I am with our esteemed priest here. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Father Ian VanHeusen, and I'm an assistant at St. Bernadette's Catholic Church in Fuquay, about to move to a campus ministry position in another parish in Greenville. I've been a priest for 2 years, and I studied at St. Charles Borromeo. And when I was there, I focused a lot of my time and attention on prayer and meditation. And I wanted to write on mindfulness, but it's hard to do if you're not a psychologist. It's a little bit different area of specialization, so to speak. But
yeah, I think this is going to be a great conversation, is bringing together the elements from prayer and spirituality from your expertise, and then what's going on in the brain and the psychology of it all from my expertise. I think this will be a fun conversation here.
Yeah, so why don't we start off the conversation just telling a little bit how we got into mindfulness? Because I don't know about for you, but for me, I've never really told the story of how at least publicly, of how I've gotten into mindfulness.
Sure.
Do you want to start it off, or do you want me to? What do you prefer?
Go ahead. I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, so a lot of it is a history of my relationship with prayer, holy hour, mental prayer, meditation, all that stuff. Use a lot of different words. So about 4 years before I entered seminary, a priest of the Diocese of Raleigh, who's the vocations director, said, guys, you need to do a holy hour every day, and you need to pray every day. So at that time, I got keys to my local church, and every morning before work and before school when I was a college student, and then before work as a teacher, I would do an hour of mental prayer, and I was praying the Liturgy of the Hours at different times. So when I entered seminary, after 4 years later, I've been praying every day, doing mental prayer and meditation, and just kind of struggling with that a little bit, but also growing a lot. I would say that's part of the growth, is that struggling. Well, then about maybe 3 or 4 years into seminary, after learning about Ignatian discernment, learning about prayer, growing every year, I picked up the book on mindfulness by Zen. Jonathan, how do you say his name again? I should have.
John Kabat-Zinn.
There you go. So I picked up his book, and I started researching a little bit of mindfulness. The way I came to research mindfulness was that a positive psychologist at the University of Penn, who I got to know, I asked him, is there any research on prayer and meditation? And he said, the only research that's done in psychology on meditation was on mindfulness. So I was like, well, let me find out about this. And I knew a bit about positive psychology from before. So I looked into it, and I just got the basic ideas. And at that time, and I'm still this way, I was just a tinker, experimenter with my holy hour. So I'm like, well, I'm doing this holy hour every day. Let me try to integrate some of this stuff into my holy hour. And I found great success with that very early on. So I would just try to integrate different tricks I'd learned, different things I'd learned, and then just kind of developing new ones. Also at that time, I talked with contemplatives who would talk a little bit about the Jesus prayer and praying with the breath. So it was kind of all interconnected. I was trying mindfulness, praying with the breath, and this was every day, doing a holy hour every day. And I did that for about 5 or 6 years before I started writing on it. And for me, it was really just trial and error, different things, that kind of thing. But I would never say, this is where I think there's a point of agreement. For me, mindfulness was never separate from my spiritual life. It's not like I was doing mindfulness and then I was doing prayer at another time. For me, it was always prayer. And I was just learning some things from mindfulness that could help my prayer. So I've calculated it since that time. I do at least an hour a day of mental prayer meditation. Some days 2 or 3 hours if I have a little bit more free time. So I literally have like thousands of hours of kind of just trying this out, integrating this stuff, and that's kind of what I write from. More than an academic scholarly perspective, I write more from the perspective of somebody who's tried these things out in solitude, retreats, things like that. If that makes sense.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really beautiful. It sounds like a really organic growth into this process, and a real discovery of your humanity. Really, you're really kind of just encountering what's truly human, and then we're finding language to make sense of it in contemporary terms.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, right? It's finding ways of expressing the lived reality. So it's not like, and I think maybe the same goes for you. It's not so much that we're talking about abstract concepts we've learned, but we're trying to translate certain sense wisdom we've learned into these terms and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would definitely say the same thing. I think for me, it also started off as prayer, and I won't say mindfulness started off as prayer, but the concept of this thing that we're doing was first for me the prayer experience side of it. And so in my time, before I was a psychologist, I was a Franciscan friar. I'd spent almost 4 years as a brother with the CFR friars up here in New York. So and we also had our daily holy hour, our daily time for meditation and prayer. And you know, I was definitely a bit clunky at it at first, and but then, you know, we had some great formation and great classes. I got to spend a lot of time with Father Benedict Rochelle and learning about spirituality, about human psychology, just sort of how to bring this all together. And it was really specifically for the purpose of our own lived out life. So we weren't learning it from anything from an academic perspective. It was more practical. And same thing in my holy hours, I started to develop this kind of prayer of abandonment to divine providence. And that's something Father Benedict used to talk about a lot is really trusting the Father and then learning how to turn our minds towards the present moment and finding God in the present moment. So this was the spirituality that we were developing. St. Francis has his whole spirituality of, it's Franciscan spirituality of filial devotion. You know, being sons and daughters of God the Father who loves us. He called God the best of fathers. And so just learning that we have this relationship with the Father who loves us so much that we have literally nothing to worry about. I mean, that really is kind of the foundation of all of our peace. And knowing that we have hope through Christ. So that was the foundation of it. And I was learning this, and I was putting this into practice in my own life, kind of separate from eventually discerning out of the Franciscans and discerning that I was called to a vocation of marriage, then joining up with the school that I went to, IPS, and studying psychology from a Catholic perspective. You know, I at first I kind of kept my spiritual life separate from what I was learning academically. And then little by little over that course of study, I started to get hints of that mindfulness as a protocol. So specifically mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, as Jon Kabat-Zinn wrote about. That was the beginning of starting to put those two pieces together. And it was always fascinating to me. I have to say, I never really totally made the connection while still at school. I realized, actually, once I started practicing, I was dealing with a particular patient who was very difficult, had a personality disorder, and I was talking to a colleague of mine who had gone on to graduate before me, was working up in Boston, Dr. Greg Kolajacek, just a really brilliant and wonderful psychologist up there. And he's the one that kind of tipped me off to using MBSR specifically for personality disorders. And it is a part of what's called DBT, which is a kind of treatment for actually a number of things now, but mindfulness is one of the components of DBT, and specifically working with personality disorders to help with emotion regulation. So I started reading a little bit more in depth about how to use it in this particular case, and then all of a sudden it just clicked. Like, this is something that I do in my own life. This is something that I practice that gives me peace, and this kind of fits into the full integration of our anthropology, understanding that if this is how God created us and this is what makes us work best, this is also going to be incredibly important for psychology, which is all about helping people be the best version of themselves through that lens of our emotional life, psychological life. So that's kind of where it all came together. And then I started developing then for the course on integration to specifically teach the 8-week MBSR protocol, but through this Catholic lens for Catholic clients who really were interested in the MBSR, but wanted to go a little bit deeper with it. So for me, they were kind of separate at first, and I brought them both together. So I do have some perspective on what is different and how to keep them separate in certain ways. But then ultimately, all things kind of culminate in the same source of truth. So there's definitely a way to wrap it all together.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And it's a fascinating different perspective, because I realized as you were talking, I've thought about this before, when we look at our two different professions. Mine's slightly different than profession, but kind of in a certain sense profession. You
don't get paid enough for it to be a profession.
So with a lot of times, the fascinating dynamic is you tend to work with folks who kind of come to you because they have problems. And now I definitely get people who come to me for problems, but then I also get a lot of times folks who come to me because they just want to go deeper in their spiritual life, which is a slightly fascinating difference. Because you would say from a psychologist's perspective, mindfulness is good for people who have problems, to help with therapy, things like that. My perspective also is that it helped me to go deeper in my prayer life. Not to necessarily, now of course there's always what I would call disorders of the heart that we're struggling with. It's not that there's ever somebody who never suffers or never struggles, but my experience and the people I've worked with, they don't necessarily have a crippling mental illness that they're trying to struggle with per se. But what I found is mindfulness can help you go deeper in that regards. I had one story in particular, was I was fasting once. And I'd always hit a roadblock with fasting. It was about 3 p.m. Without a doubt, 2 to 3 p.m. And always, without fail, at the seminary, there was always this woman. We didn't necessarily like her. Well, I'm slightly kidding. She would bring donuts and like cookies, and it was always Friday, and it was always in the afternoon.
It's horrible.
So I always knew when I was fasting that there was going to be a bunch of sweets in the common room just waiting for me. And so I would always be like super hungry. I would try to do a holy hour around 3 because there's not a whole lot going on in the afternoon. And I would always hit this like wall with my fasting. Well, when I was first learning about mindfulness, I took that into the fast, and I just used that body scan technique to kind of feel the sensations in my stomach. And it was like, bam, I broke through the wall. It was a great prayer period for me. But it was like fasting. I was like, oh, that's, learning the body scan, things like that. Help me break through that wall with fasting, if that makes sense.
That's really awesome. Yeah, it's totally helpful. It's a great point to see those differences of how I came to it and you did, because it's, as a faithful Catholic and somebody trying to develop my own prayer life and grow in my spiritual life and closeness to God, that's how I experience it. And then there's this other part where I'm helping people also grow out of their disorders. But at the end of the day, they really do need to come together. And it's interesting you mentioned positive psychology, because that's kind of the story of positive psychology in a nutshell. Positive psychology was the brainchild of Martin Seligman, who originally studied psychology. He developed this concept called learned helplessness, I think in the 70s. And he, all of psychology has always been studying how people are messed up, and how to get them, as Freud said, how to get them from misery to unhappiness. Where it's just like such a negative twist on it. And so you mentioned positive psychology. You probably know some of this already, but but Martin Seligman was, just had this awesome insight that, like, why are we going to just study all the people who are messed up? Why don't we study the people who are healthy and happy? And so by doing that, he developed the whole field of positive psychology. So instead of centering on his expertise in learned helplessness, he created, he developed a new sense of learned optimism. I think he had a book called Learned Optimism. And then that started him on this movement towards positive psychology, and then ultimately mindfulness is part of, flourishing and thriving for healthy people. So, really we can kind of bring them all together, and at the end of the day, whether we're talking about moving out of real discord or real disorder, or just deepening our spiritual life, learning the way that we tick as humans, which this lens of mindfulness gives us a lot of deep insight, will help us just move that next step on our journey.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought in the optimism thing, and that learned optimism and the positive psychology. because I think as Catholics, our initial reaction could be like, well, where's the cross of that? Or where's the cross in that? Where's this sense of sacrifice, contrition? But what I'm coming to appreciate as I've integrated this more and more is, especially I talk a lot about the Beatitudes and things like that, I've come to believe that we miss, perhaps for a generation, perhaps because of some confusion after Vatican II or just some misunderstandings. See, what I would argue is that contrition, all of that good Catholic piety, is the path to being truly happy and being truly open to that creativity, like some of those guys would talk about, things like that. It's not, I think optimism on a natural level is a great virtue, it's a great gift, but there's a sense that we come to a confidence in the Holy Spirit that's even a little bit deeper, but it doesn't like destroy. It's not like grace works against nature. All those natural goods are elevated and purified and oriented towards Christ. I think that's where I'm at more and more, especially things like I'm big these days on contrition for sins, which people find funny because I'm pretty happy. Like I'm smiley, I laugh a lot. So people like, why are you, like I can see people being wondering, well, how is it that you can focus so much? But what I'm finding in my own prayer life is when I focus on things like contrition and sorrow for sins, especially when I'm in a consolation, I've talked about this more, it increases my capacity to love, and that helps me to be more happy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and it's totally connected to that filial devotion and filial obedience. Like I was just talking with somebody doing an interview on teenage depression. Mm-hmm. And really, when we were reflecting on how like our culture has become so godless, and we've developed this sense that we don't need an idea of God or God. And interestingly, in Martin Seligman's Positive Psychology, there are 5 aspects of flourishing. So it's statistically, there are 5 independent variables that somebody who can experience a trauma without PTSD has in their life. So he came up with this idea called post-traumatic growth. Yeah. And post-traumatic growth is the opposite of PTSD. So some people go through a trauma and they have PTSD. Some people have a trauma and, the old adage, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, kind of applies to them.
Yeah.
So that's post-traumatic growth. And he found out statistically by being fed like millions upon millions of dollars from the government, because this is all he's been hired by the military to do all of this work, because obviously this is going to save the government money if they can avoid having to do treatment on PTSD after the fact, if they can train guys beforehand. And so out of all this research, out of these hundreds of thousands of subjects that he studied, people that he looked at their lives, one of the 5 categories is meaning in life, and specifically breaking down that people have a sense that there's somebody out there bigger than us.
Yeah.
And that's one of the 5 fundamental differences between somebody who will suffer PTSD and somebody who will become stronger through their traumas. So having an idea that this whole thing doesn't rest on our shoulders, that there's somebody out there who's really in control of it all. And I think that ties directly in with your idea of contrition, because if there's somebody else in charge, that means that we have to follow the rules. And that allows for the fact that sometimes we don't follow the rules. And that means that when we don't follow the rules, we have to seek forgiveness. We have to have hearts of contrition. And so we're not stuck on this sort of immediate or temporal reality of like, oh, we're so bad, we're so guilty. What's the real meaning behind that is, wow, there's somebody out there who actually we could be guilty towards. That there's somebody out there who's really in control. So ultimately that means we're not in control of all this, so we can rest easy.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. And that's fascinating. You mentioned Seligman's work with the Army, because I actually have, I don't know if I'm supposed to have this. I won't tell who gave it to me. It's one of their training manuals for the Army. where it's positive psychology. Like if you ever hear me say thought traps, it comes from that this training module that they gave for the special forces. And I know somebody, I had a source that gave me the binder, and it's a gold mine. I mean, it's really neat stuff, you know, and a lot of those things, they're incredibly fascinating. And I tend to have a very positive view on the Army in general. My dad was Army, and my sister was Army as well, and a West Point grad. So I tend to have a very positive view. Because I mean, like for example, their leadership manual, it rates emotional intelligence as an important characteristic of an Army officer, which I think would be mind-blowing to most people that's the Army.
It's so important. You know, I love the Army. I love the military. There's a podcast I listen to, this guy Jocko Willig, and he's like a Navy SEAL trainer. He's like West Coast head of like SEAL division training, and he creates scenarios for training for these guys that are trying to figure out like when everything hits the fan, what does that look like? And he creates these scenarios. So this guy's intense. His podcast is awesome. Now he does business consulting, but a lot of times he talks about that in telling stories from his experience that you know, in terms of leadership and in terms of what it's really like out there, that the emotional intelligence is the most important thing. Like knowing when a guy's breaking or not, or why he is or why he's not, those are all important things. And especially for like a squad commander or leader, like to know his guys, he's got to have those insights into what's making people tick and where the breaking points are. So that's really huge.
Absolutely. And a big part of that is also knowing your own emotions and knowing what's going on inside of you as well. It's a fascinating thing. Because I've realized that's like a huge, you know, they talk about empathy and things like that, the importance of that. And I have realized that with ministry or with workplaces and stuff like that. I mean, those are extreme cases where you have to save lives. You have to know what's going on. But it's fascinating.
Psychology is really changing the face of the military. A lot of Seligman's work has been really transformative. Like they realized that all these guys being taken away from their spouses, their kids, were really suffering because another one of the 5 categories is relationships, and you have to maintain healthy relationships for flourishing. So then they started doing a lot more to like implement Skype calls and helping the guys on the front end to stay connected to what's going on at home. And it changed all these different rating scales in satisfaction and mental health from the front lines.
That's fascinating. Well, that's neat stuff. So there's the positive psychology. And then, you know, one of the things I took away from positive psychology, I don't know if I've ever talked publicly about this connection. I use the word a lot. You might know his name, Mihaly. It's a long name. He's at Penn. He wrote Flow Psychology.
Oh yeah. I forgot his name, but I know who you're talking about.
Poor guy. You should change his name.
It's tough. You gotta change it.
Well, I mean, his name. I've heard it said, but I'm like, I can't ever remember it. But you know that connection, like with flow psychology and with things like sports, that's always been a connection I've drawn out a lot. Is this connection with sports? Because that's where I even learned a lot of life lessons myself. And then also there is a dramatic connection with the spiritual life and growth in the spiritual life. As you move from kind of beginning to kind of mastery and creativity and things like that. Maybe we could even look at it that way. You know, they talk about the 3 ages of the soul. They talk about 3 ages of the spiritual life. There's the beginner, which would be the purgative, the illuminative, which would be kind of the intermediate, and then the saintly, the expert, is the unitive. And maybe we could even look at it in a certain sense as beginner, mastery, and then almost like creative. You know, that there's a certain creativity. And because I found that we were talking about mindfulness, I imagine because your mindfulness program, it's 6 week protocol, right?
8 weeks.
Is it 8 weeks? 8 week protocol. So a big challenge for you, and I know it's a big challenge for me when I'm doing spiritual direction and working with people, is getting people to commit every day to doing these practices. And it's like, we all know, like me and you know, if you do this every day, it's going to be awesome. Like, and if you do this every day for the rest of your life, you're going to grow and grow and grow. And it's an incredible thing. But getting people to stick with it, that's always a challenge. Yeah.
That's the biggest challenge. That's the thing that I keep coming back to in trying to perfect the delivery and the content and everything else. But at the end of the day, you have to have engagement, and people have to have a reason for what they're doing. And a lot of times, I think a lot of times people don't actually take things seriously until they've realized the consequences of not taking it seriously. And so that can be that's what I see a lot in my line of work, because I usually get the people who've kind of hit rock bottom and now they're ready to make the changes. And even then it's really tough. I mean, you're talking about daily exercises for 8 weeks. That's pretty tough. But something I relate it back to a lot is and trying to figure out how they've cracked the code so that we can implement it in our work too. But it's all the like P90X videos. Like Tony Horton and Beachbody. That's the whole production company that does like all these different videos, whether it's they have Insanity, P90X, like P90X 2, 3, 5, 7, 12, or whatever else they're doing. They engage people on these projects, which are 3 months long. They're 90 days. And they get people just doing these exercises every day. And their whole motto is like, just press play, just press play. Like, just sit down in front of it, press play. No matter if you don't get your best workout ever in, like just a daily routine. Anybody's going to change their physique if they're doing something. Like, I don't care if you bring out like Russell Simmons from the 70s or something. If you do his workout every day for 90 days, you're going to have significant results. Yeah. So like figuring out how to crack that code, I think, is really important for us in ministry.
Yeah, I think that's where, where we need to learn from the secular culture, because I know tons of people that they'll admonish people to pray, to do holy hours, to commit to adoration, whatever it might be. But the question becomes, how do we motivate that behavior? How do we inspire it? And you're giving me ideas for future homilies, by the way, because we work with college kids, and college students. Sorry, I got to get out of the habit. They're not kids; they're adults. But working with college students, and my big thing is I want to motivate them to pray every day, go to confession, and go to Sunday Mass. Like that's like top priority to motivate them to do those things. But maybe I gotta be inspired by some of these workout things. Now, ironically, of course, there was a workout program I signed up for that I didn't stay with. But I am walking every day. I'm walking every day, but I'm not doing the program. But I get the emails from them and I get the notifications, and I feel guilty. like I'm letting down so-and-so on the other end or whatever. It's the funniest thing.
Well, I think we are results driven, and that's a. Are you still there? Your video turned off.
Yeah, I just got to. There was a phone call coming in.
Oh, no problem.
Okay. All right, we're good now.
Okay, so I think part of our humanity, part of the way God created us, is that we're results driven. We're goal oriented. I mean, we're made for a vocation. We're made for a destiny of perfection, and somewhere within our constitution is a drive towards perfection. And so that's kind of been, I think that aspect of our humanity has been monopolized by or taken advantage of by these secular marketing programs, and we should be able to do the same. And I was thinking, like I always say in my course, like there actually is brain scan technology where we look at what a brain looks like before and after an 8-week program.
Yeah. And
that's what P90X does. They show you the bodies, right? They have like thousands of before and after photos of like, this is your flabby self at day 1, and this is your cut physique at day 90. And then people see that and they're like, I can have that kind of result because I'm relating to the flabby side over here, and I want to be in that physique over there. And so it kind of starts our motivation process. And unfortunately, it's too expensive now to take a picture of everybody's brain. But I think if you could see, like, okay, this is the different part of the brain that looks different after 8 weeks of mindfulness practice every day, and these are significant shifts and changes in hormone levels and different hormone activity, and this is how it affects the way you feel every day. And I was just thinking while you were talking, if only we had a way to see the spiritual reality of where we are in the spiritual life.
Well, the Catholic Church gives us that. I mean, there is.
Well, I mean, a visual picture of like your aura. This is getting into that new age. Like your aura is brown or your aura is blue. Or
well, of course, the problem is this is where St. Thomas Aquinas and the theologians would say, growth in the spiritual life is a movement from visible to invisible realities.
Good point.
So the growth is things that you can't necessarily see.
Yeah.
And that's probably the biggest error that people fall into the spiritual life, is they try to look for some tangible, like I'm more popular or whatever it might be, whatever those false scripts are. But there is a description of, actually, where I would say, and this is what I'm getting into lately, the description of those heights are two things: the gifts of the Holy Spirit and the Beatitudes. Those are kind of the mount of Christian perfection. So what I'm giving people a lot of times to try to inspire that growth, and I think what we could do is lay it out a little bit more, is the Beatitude, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. It's funny, we've heard that so many times that we fail to realize how crazy radical that is, and how it's actually almost scandalous. You see God, like that's your goal, to see God in this life. Like, what does that mean? And of course, the tradition would say things like infused contemplation, abiding sense of God's presence. Even those things can be somewhat misunderstood. But so I'll tell you what drove me for years was I read in Thomas Merton, particularly Thomas Merton and then St. John of the Cross, this idea of contemplation, of the dark night of the soul, of mystical union. And that's what I was working for every single day. I wanted contemplation. That was my goal. And that's what drove me. And that's what drove me out into solitude on retreats. I was seeking after contemplation. And I think that would be what I'm trying to do now, is how do I explain that? How do I explain? I had once, it was actually a fun time. I'd had a couple of glasses of wine. I was at a wedding. I was at a table, and this was, for me, it was like one of the greatest moments of my life. I was talking with this guy, and I just was describing contemplation. I don't know what he said, what I said, but at one point he turns to me and goes, how can I attain that? Or how can I get that?
Wow.
I was like, well, it's a long journey.
Wow, that's awesome.
But I remember, to have somebody actually say that, because I've always wanted somebody to say that, how do I attain that?
That's so full of image. Like that picture, you're at a wedding, you're drinking wine, you're talking about contemplation, and you're sharing that, and it's bearing fruit in him, and he wants it. Wow, that's a lot.
It was a fun conversation. But yeah, that's what I sometimes wonder, and like you said, we're goal oriented. And that's the thing. I think maybe that's the big problem right now sometimes with Catholic teaching, is we don't necessarily express what the goal is. So if I told you that you would experience a happiness more profound than suffering, a happiness that would reach into the core of your being, that even if you suffer, you would be happy. In the midst of everything, you would have a peace that the world cannot take away. And now I start to explain to you, that's why you got to obey the 10 Commandments. That's why you got to avoid the capital sins or the deadly sins. That's why you got to build virtue. That's why you got to pray every day. That's why you got to practice mindfulness every day, because you're working towards happiness. I think a lot more people would be inspired to do that, but as opposed to,
we've got to reach in and really touch their humanity, touch their real experience.